Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to model a working sundial in Rhinoceros 3D, as well as give you an introduction into how Rhinoceros 3D works. So you can see in this scene that I have a sundial set up that I've modeled, and using the sun tool in Rhino, I can actually simulate sunlight depending on where you are in the real world. And by scrubbing this timeline here, we can simulate where the actual sun is going to be and what the lighting conditions are. So why don't we first get started with a basic introduction to Rhino and how to use it. So why don't we get started. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is start with a new file, and you may want to do this too to make sure you're in the correct units. So I'm going to go to File, New, and we're going to scroll down to small objects, millimeters, because we're going to use millimeters as our modeling units, and this object is going to be rather small, so we can use this template. I'm going to click Open. And so what this does is make sure that we're working in the correct units, because Rhino models everything accurately to scale, and you can type in exact dimensions. So the first thing you'll see are these four windows, and depending on whether you're on a Mac or a PC, some of these toolbars may be moved around. This window, the command line, may be down here or it may be up there depending on where you are. But I'm going to show you all the commands that you're going to need to model it from beginning to end. So the first thing you're going to do is double click on the word perspective to maximize this window. By the way, these are the four views. You have your top, your front, your right, and your perspective. So we're going to double click the perspective word. And if you're on a Mac, it's super important that you do have a mouse with three buttons, a left button, a right button, and a scroll wheel. So the scroll wheel zooms in and out if you roll the scroll wheel. Holding down, right click, and clicking and dragging rotates. And then holding down the Shift key on your keyboard while pressing the right mouse button pans. So why don't we practice that for a while? So right mouse button rotates the view. Clicking the middle mouse button, scrolling the middle mouse button zooms in and out. And holding down Shift and right click pans. Alternatively, you can also hold down Control and right click to zoom in more smoothly. I tend to use this a bit more because the scroll wheel tends to be a bit more notchy, and sometimes you want to get in at a certain level of detail to look at your object. So once again, that was Control right click to zoom in the other way, but scroll wheel works just as well too. So what we're looking at here is the scene grid, and we're actually going to turn that off right now. So let's get used to typing in commands. I'm going to type grid, and so as I type that in, GRI, you can see that it's listing all the commands that have those letters in it, or it tries to guess what you want to type. And grid actually appears before I finish typing. And at this point, I can just press spacebar to press enter. And then it's going to give me a bunch of options here. And I can move my mouse and I can click show grid. And I'm going to click no. And so that turns the grid off. So now I can continue to rotate and zoom. But the grid is turned off. And I can press spacebar again to end the command. So let's practice. Why don't we click this window, this icon for box, and if you don't see it, we can type box. So all these commands are duplicated with the command line. The way I learned it when I was learning Rhino was using just the command line only. So whenever possible, I'm going to try to show you both using these buttons and using the command line. As you get better at using Rhino, I rarely use these buttons at all because some of them, there's a lot of buttons within buttons if you hold down this little triangle. And sometimes it becomes just slower to try to hunt down the exact icon down rather than just typing it in. So let's just type box into the command line. So I'm going to type box and press spacebar to enter. And it's going to ask me where the first corner of the base is. And I'm going to click here, just anywhere you want. And it's going to ask me where the other corner of the base is. And I'm going to click somewhere over here. And now it's going to ask me what the height is. And then I move the mouse up and I drag. And so as you can tell by that, it sort of guides you along by asking you what the next thing you should do is. So the next thing we're actually going to do is click this little arrow here and next to the word perspective and switch to shaded mode. And in shaded mode, you'll see that this box actually has 6 sides and is a solid object. And we can practice rotating and zooming in a little bit. So why don't you practice that for a minute, rotating around this box. And we can also move the box by selecting it, by left clicking on it. And then the easiest thing to do is to drag. Click and drag. And so you can sort of move the box around like that. So I can continue to click and drag to move the box around. And I think now will be a good time to talk about some of the snap and ortho. So if we click this button that says ortho at the bottom, it will now only let me click and drag in increments of 90 degrees. So I can only drag absolutely in the Y direction, or if I click and drag absolutely in the X direction. So now you can also right click the word ortho and you can set what angle you can drag things at. So if I click set ortho angle, I'm going to left click that. Up here it's going to ask me what is my new ortho angle. So I can put 30 for instance. And now it'll let me drag in multiples of 30-degree increments. So I usually actually just leave this on 90. So I'm going to set this back to 90 by right-clicking set ortho angle, and I'm going to type 90. So the other thing that's important in Rhino is preciseness, and preciseness comes with snapping objects together. And this may be turned off if you're on a Mac, but if it is, you're going to look for the button that says OSnap, and you're going to click it, and this set of options are going to appear. And so these are the snapping options that let you snap an object from point to point, for instance. So let's make another box. I'm going to type box again, and I'm going to click drag and drag up. So let's say I wanted to put this box exactly next to this box. If I just dragged it over like this, I can sort of get it close, but then I have to sort of keep dragging, and I can't precisely line them up edge to edge. But you can do that with object snapping. So this is really important when you're building something that requires precision. So with my OSnap enabled, and I'm going to click end point. Let's enable end point, mid, intersection, and perpendicular. So all the other boxes should be unchecked, but let's just click and check end point, mid, in, and perp. And so now, when I want to move this to this, it'll let me move this corner precisely to this corner. So up here in the command line, I'm going to press M and then spacebar. And so that's the command for move. So I'm going to click from this end, and then I'm going to click that end. And so now, as you can see, it's snapped precisely to that corner. With these other snaps enabled, other things will show up. So let's try M again to move. And then it's gonna ask me select the object to move, and I want to move this object again. And it's gonna ask me press enter when done. And enter works, and so does spacebar. I usually press spacebar because it's the bigger key and it's a bit easier. Again, you should be working with your right hand on the mouse and your left hand over the keyboard. Have your finger resting on the lower left side of the keyboard, so you can easily access both the shift key and the spacebar. So I'm going to press enter, and I'm going to move from this midpoint now to the midpoint of this one. And so this box will pop up when I'm close to the midpoint, or when I'm close to the end, or when I'm perpendicular. So you can move things very precisely with these snap tools. So additionally, there's other commands like rotate and scale. So let's take a look at scale. So I'm gonna type scale, and it may ask you to do scale 1D or scale 2D, but we just want scale. So while this is active, you can press left mouse button to press enter and select objects to scale. And I'm going to select this object, press enter, which is a spacebar. And now it's going to ask me the origin point. So I want to scale the box from this edge. So because my O snap is on, I can precisely select this endpoint. And scale, so it's asking either for a scale factor or a first reference point. So if I typed in scale factor, I can type in 0.5, for instance, 0.5, and that'll scale it down exactly by half. And I press enter to finish that command. Control Z undoes the command, so I'm going to press Control Z. And let's try scale again. And instead of typing scale, I'm just going to press spacebar, and that's going to actually repeat the last command. So since my last command was scale, it's going to ask me the origin point again. So I'm going to click here, and I'm actually going to give it a reference point, which is this other corner of the box. And I'm going to left click, and then I can scale down, not to an exact percentage, but I can move the mouse to where I like it visually. And then I left click to finish the command, and it scales like that. The next command I'm going to show you is rotate. You can select the object that you want to rotate, and we can type rotate. And again, it's going to ask me for the center of the rotation, which let's make it this corner. And angle or first reference point. So again, we can either type an angle, or what I use most often is a reference point. If I have ortho on, make sure you have it on, and click here, and then it's going to let me rotate in 90-degree increments from that pivot point. So I also have copy on, so as I rotate it, it's going to make multiple copies. So to enable that, you click copy yes or copy no. You left click it to enable it and to disable it. So usually there's that copy option is available for all the commands like scale or even move. So like if I was going to scale it, I could select the object, scale, copy yes, and then this time I'm going to scale it down like this. And so it made another smaller object in that one, and we can select it, and it's going to ask me which one I'm trying to select, and I can move and drag and rotate it out like that, and drag it out so you can see it. The next thing that I want to show you is the gumball command, which is it makes moving and scaling things a bit quicker, but it's less precise. So we can type gumball into the command line, and I'm going to click the word on. And now when that's on, you're going to have this tool, which is actually, it's a gimbal. If you've used any other 3D programs, this will look more familiar to you. It's a bit less precise, but with ortho on, we can still rotate in increments without having to run the command, without having to run like the scale or the move command every time. This object actually lets you do any of them at once. So with this object selected, I can click and drag the green arrow to move it, but I can also click and drag this green handle to scale in that direction. Or I can shift click and drag to scale uniformly on any of the handles. So if I let go of shift, it's only going to scale in that direction. And then if I click on these arcs, and if I turn ortho off, it's going to let me rotate along those axes. So this is a bit faster, but it's actually a bit less precise because I still want to, let's say, move this from this point to that precise corner, and there's you just don't, the gumball doesn't let you work that way. It's more about for quickly moving an object into place. So if I wanted to move this corner specifically to this corner here, or to scale it a specific value, I would still use the command line options. So the next thing I want to talk about is curves. Curves or lines or splines are primarily how things are modeled in Rhino. So why don't we click this icon, or the polyline icon. It may look differently on a Mac, but we can also type polyline, and it's going to ask me for the start of the polyline, and I'm going to click somewhere here, and let's turn ortho on. And notice I did that in the middle of a command. I started the command already, and I went down here, and halfway through it I turned it on, and so then it restricts my movement. So I'm going to click once over here to continue the line, and maybe once over here, and then now I'm going to turn ortho off, and then maybe draw a couple more points like this, and then I'm going to press close, which is up here, or I can press C, type the letter C, and press spacebar to enter, and that will close the line. So I can do that again. This time let's click and drag. Not click and drag, just click several points to draw this shape. And then before you feel like you want to end it, I want to press C and then enter. Then I can press spacebar to run the command again. And so this time I pressed the spacebar by accident, and so then this left the spline open, as opposed to this. This is a closed shape, and this is an open shape. So let's work with just this one. And one of the most important commands that we're going to be using in this class and in Rhino in general is extrude. And so I'm going to take this curve and extrude it into a shape, a 3D shape. So right now this curve is just a 2D a flat drawing. And I'm going to select this, and I'm going to type extrude. And I actually want extrude curve. It may, depending on what commands you use the most, in my case it was trying to extrude surf, but that's another command we're not using yet. I want extrude curve. And so as soon as I do that, it gives me this option. This happens, and I want to make sure solid is clicked. Yes. If solid is off, you can see it doesn't have a top anymore, so the top and the bottom are open. And as soon as I click solid yes and click enter, it's going to make an object that's enclosed on all sides. So I'm going to try the same thing again on this open curve. So if I select just this line and type extrude, see what happened was it tried to run extrude surf. I'm going to select this and type extrude. And this time I'm going to make sure that I'm using the right command, extrude curve. And so it doesn't matter whether it's solid or not, it's just going to be, because the line isn't closed, the object isn't going to close. So now it's the series of walls, and it doesn't have a top or a bottom. So this is considered an open surface, and this is considered a closed surface. And that's primarily how we're going to be constructing the sundial out of just that command. There may be a few other ones that I'll show you. But why don't you practice drawing some shapes for a moment with the polyline tool. So we'll draw a couple other shapes. And I'm going to press C spacebar to close it. And then I can type extrude, CRV, and then I press enter. And so now we've made a bunch of shapes like this. Now I'm going to quickly show you how to draw curved objects, but we may not use this as much until later in towards the end, especially on the sundial pointer. So to draw a curve, let's go to this icon and hold down the arrow here to reveal this other box. And let's use this one called Curve Interpolate Points. Now, when I click that, you can see that the actual command is called interp CRV. But since I'm using the button, I don't have to type that in. Conversely, I could press escape to end the command and just type interp CRV. And it's exactly the same thing. So when I'm running this command, I want to make sure ortho's off, and now I can click a bunch of points. And this is more of like the pen tool in Illustrator, if you've ever used that. And like the straight polyline, when I near the endpoint of what I want to draw the curve to be, I press C and then spacebar to close it. However, I can tell ahead of time this shape has an intersecting line, so when I run extrude curve, it's going to tell me it's self-intersecting, and this may produce undesirable results. And I click yes and make it anyways, and so it actually did it. But this isn't a truly good object, especially if you're, let's say, 3D printing or laser cutting this piece. But this will work as long as you keep it on the computer screen, if this remains a digital file. So ideally I try not to do that. See, this came out as like a separate object. So the sort of drawback to being extremely precise, an extremely precise modeler, it's a bit like AutoCAD in that sometimes the preciseness, you have to be very careful when you're actually modeling it. Otherwise, you'll have errors in your geometry, especially when you're trying to build things or 3D print some of these objects. So you have to be careful with that. So the solution would be to, let's say, run that command again, the curve command, but not get so close with my shapes, or to just be more careful. So this shape is actually completely closed and it's not self-intersecting, so I can extrude that. And so when I do that, it makes a shape that's completely closed. Over here is your properties window and your layers. Why don't we quickly talk about that? You have 4 tabs here. Properties. And within that, you have these four. You have object, material, texture mapping, and decals. And primarily, I'm going to leave this on object. So this tells you everything about the object in the scene. So it says it's a closed extrusion here. And let's go over to our layers tab. And I'm going to put this sort of like if you've used Photoshop before, these sort of work in the same way, where I can put this object onto layer 1, for instance. And actually, let's click this icon and just make a new layer. By default, I can't remember if the Macintosh version has these 5 layers by default, but this is how you make a new layer. So I'm going to click this, and I made a new layer called layer 6. And I'm going to click this paint swatch here and assign it a color. Let's pick aquamarine here. And I'm going to select this object and then right click on the layer name and change object layer. And so now as soon as I put it onto this layer, it's going to change it to this aquamarine color. So this is useful when you have a lot of objects in the scene and you want to turn some of them off by pressing this light bulb. So when I turn it off, only the extrusion disappears, but then the actual curve itself was actually drawn. If you go to your properties window, you can tell, and if you look under layers, you can see it's on the default layer. And from here, I can actually click this arrow and move it to another layer. I can move it to the aquamarine layer. And when I do that, well, actually, let's move it to layer 1. When I do that, it turns red, because now it's on the red layer. And when I move it to the aquamarine layer, layer 6, it's actually going to disappear because that layer's off. Moving back to my layers tab, I can double click on the layer name to actually rename it. So I can name this like extrusions. Enter. And so that's where I'm going to keep all my extruded shapes. Like I can select this and I shift left click to add things to my selection. And then I'm going to right click on the word extrusion again and change objects layer. And so now they're all going to turn aquamarine except that one cube I didn't select, and now I can turn them all off. So you can get pretty organized by putting all your curves on one layer, all your extrusions on another layer, your text objects on another layer, and so on and so on. And you can also put layers within layers. Like if, for example, I wanted to make another so let's say if I wanted to put, if I wanted to separate straight extrusions from curves, I would create 2 new layers by clicking this twice, and I can double click layer 6 and rename it to curved, and I can double click layer 7 and change this to straight. And now I can left click and drag on top of the extrusion word, and so they become nested within the extrusion layer. So within this, I can select my curve object and put it onto my curve layer, and select all my straight objects and put it onto my straight layer. And then this check mark means that this is the current layer that I'm creating new objects on, and I'm going to click that checkbox and move it to default. So now I have this extrusion layer. When I click this light bulb, all of the shapes turn off. When I click it back on, all of them turn on. But when I go into the sub layers, I can turn just the straight objects off, or just the curved objects off. So again, this is super useful when you have a lot of parts, and I like to model fairly organized if I know I'm going to have a lot of stuff going on. So why don't you take some time and practice all these techniques, and we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll dive into the sundial.